Hey folks, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hi, Layne.
Hi, hello everyone. Welcome.
So friends, if this is your first time here, let me introduce us. My name is Lisa Mason Ziegler, and I am joined here today with my friend and co-team member, Layne Angelo. Layne is the seed manager here at the Gardener's Workshop. And this podcast is all about seeds and anything related to that. And we are really happy to bring to you today, we're going to be talking about seed storing, seed buying, and seed saving a little bit even. So friends, we are excited to talk about these topics. But before we jump in, this podcast is brought to you by thegardenersworkshop.com. And over there, you are going to find just a lot of great resources from blogs and our podcast, our sister podcast, Field and Garden, as well as lots of how-to videos, our online garden shop, as well as a packed library of our online courses. So we invite you to drop in over there. All right, Layne, let's take it away.
All right. Yes. Welcome in. This has been a highly requested episode, I have to say. So we are going to talk all about buying seeds, how to store the seeds that you're buying. And we're also even going to touch on some things you might need to be aware of if you're wanting to save seeds from plants that you've actually grown. And I want to say right off the bat that when we're talking about seeds today, we're going to be talking about what are known as orthodox seeds. These are most of your typical flower or vegetable seeds. They can be dried down to low moisture contents and then be frozen without damage. And we're not talking about recalcitrant seeds, which actually need to be stored with higher moisture content, and those cannot be frozen without being damaged. So we're just talking today about your typical orthodox seeds. So shall we get started?
We shall. And friends, don't you just love Layne? I just love all these little nerd facts. It's amazing. Thank you, Layne.
Oh, you are welcome. All right, so we are going to go right into it. And we should also mention, if you would like to join us over on YouTube, we're going to have a slideshow of the questions that we're discussing. And we're also going to be alternating back and forth with Lisa and I actually having the conversation. So join us over on the Gardener's Workshop YouTube if you'd like to watch this instead of listening to it. So the first question is, are seeds living or non-living entities? And why is proper seed storage so important?
So that's a great question. So yes, seeds are definitely living, live, viable piece of the pie of starting plants, right? And I think, well, I know from a firsthand experience that a lot of people that kind of struggle with seed starting sometimes, when we backtrack with them what steps they've gone through, in fact, the seeds that they started with weren't even viable, right? And that is why proper seed storage is so very, very important. And that's why it's also important where you purchase your seeds from, so the storage was taken care of before you actually got it. So the seed storage is basically keeping them at a temperature and out of moisture. They need to be dry and cool. Are we going to talk more in depth about that? Or
we'll go really in depth about that, so you don't have to touch any more on that right now.
Okay.
And I also wanted to use a quote. Rhonda, our warehouse manager, wrote a blog a few years ago about seed storage for the website, and she quoted Dr. Carol Baskin at the University of Kentucky, who likes to tell her students that a seed is a baby plant in a box with its lunch, which is just such a cute little description and also so accurate. It's so accurate.
Yes.
So we're not going to go really in depth on seed biology, but I just wanted to touch on some of the things to be aware of. So inside a seed, there's a little embryo. This is like a baby plant. It's got its first little root, the radicle. It has a stem. It has these modified leaves called cotyledons, which are the leaves you actually see when your seedling sprouts. They don't typically look like the true plant leaves, but that's what you're seeing. And also within the seed, there is an endosperm, which is a nutrient-rich tissue that supports the seed while it's dormant and also while it's germinating, going through the entire germination process. It's the food supply for the seed. Certain seeds like beans, they actually use up most of that endosperm while the embryo is developing. So most of the food is actually stored in the cotyledons, but that's beside the point. And then this is all wrapped up. This is all wrapped up in a seed coat, which is a protective outer layer. This just helps to keep things from going in or out of the seed. So it keeps light out, it keeps moisture out of the seed, it helps prevent mechanical damage, it helps the seed from drying out. And oftentimes seeds with thicker coats are the ones that tend to have a longer shelf life. So seeds are definitely a living thing. They have a lifespan, and the way we handle and store them can either help to prolong that lifespan or it can actually shorten it.
Yes.
So
Yes,
they're
that's
definitely
true.
living things. So how long does seed typically last? And what is seed viability?
So it varies greatly from, I just actually read this past weekend or watched on a video, a seed grower talking about tomato seeds and just how many years they can last. I mean, just over a decade or more. And obviously, if you store the seed in its conditions, it can really have a long life. The problem is that not many of us provide those conditions most often in our households, right? And so that keeps all those wonderful things you just explained, that keeps all of those things just sitting there ready to wait to jump into action once you actually plant that little seed.
Yes, a seed's longevity depends on a lot of things. It depends on what plant are you talking about? What type of seed coat does that particular seed have? Was the seed harvested when it was fully mature or was it immature? And how has it been handled and how has it been stored? So there's a lot of things that can affect the shelf life of a seed. And viability just refers to the ability of a seed to germinate readily and develop into a strong, healthy, vigorous seedling. And I also wanted to mention that seed vigor is a different thing than the germination rate. So a seed can actually lose a lot of its vigor and still be able to germinate. So if you've ever had really old seed lying around and you've tried to germinate it and maybe you got 10 sprouts out of 100 seeds, well, that seed, chances are that it's lost a lot of its vigor and those seedlings are most likely going to be weaker. And in turn, the plants a lot of times might be weaker. I know, Lisa, you tend to discard trays if they haven't met a certain germination percentage. Isn't that right?
It is very true because we know that the puny plants or puny transplants typically lead us to puny garden plants. And when you have limited space like I do, why not just start with the very best you can?
Yep. And the goal whenever we're storing seeds is we want to keep the seeds having as low as possible of a metabolic rate while we're storing them. We want them to conserve as many of their food stores for when they're really going to need it when they go through the germination process. We don't want them to prematurely use them all up, which we'll talk more about in a moment.
And and I was just thinking about that little coat the little lunchbox that we're imagining.
Yes.
The more of a lunchbox that a seed has, those are the seeds that oftentimes are very difficult to get to germinate because that
exactly
is so thick. Yeah,
exactly. Are there any seeds with a particularly short shelf life that I should be aware of? So I know there are definitely seeds when we're ordering for the store that we're really careful about and we don't want to order until we're ready to pack them. So what seeds come to mind for you, Lisa?
sure. First and foremost is larkspur. I know that's like, as you mentioned earlier, when we were discussing this, feverfew is one that can be just, it's those ones that we say, gosh, that seed is kind of hard to start. Like one year you have a great success, and then the next year, maybe not such a great success. So feverfew and larkspur. As I mentioned earlier, tomatoes are a great poster child. I literally have germinated 14-year-old big beef tomato seeds. And so tomatoes are at the opposite end of the spectrum. And I think even any seed that's pelleted in any way, that definitely has a shorter shelf life. And when we do get pelleted seeds, we do our best to try to use them all up that season. Which ones have you thought of?
I thought of the same as you, the larkspur, feverfew, strawflower. I would
Yes,
throw
yes,
in there.
straw flowers for sure.
And like you said, anything pelleted. These are all just things that we're careful about when we're ordering for the store and they're best fresh. They have a shorter shelf life than some other things.
Yes.
All right, when should I buy my seed? If I buy my seed in the fall, will it still be good for planting in the spring? We hear this question a lot, especially at this time of year.
Yes, for sure. So literally, if you are storing your seeds properly, you can purchase seeds really anytime if you're storing them properly to use for at the very minimum for the next season. Those few that we just mentioned that kind of we know that they may have a shorter shelf life. You may not want to overbuy those, but in general, we store our seeds. I mean, we will do 2 or 3 years sometimes, especially if there's going to be a shortage of a seed. You hear the rumblings. I'll buy extra seed. I try to buy in 3-year windows is what I look at, because we store our seeds properly.
Okay, let's go on to the next question because it's related. So how much seed should I buy? Should I buy just enough for the upcoming growing season or for multiple seasons? So you kind of just touched on this, but
sure. I think that certainly there is an economic savings when you buy larger packages. Like if you buy one of our jumbo packs versus a regular size pack of seed. I totally think for people that are committed gardeners, buy the jumbo pack. And if it lasts you 2 seasons and you store it properly, it should be fine. So when I am trying to figure out how much seed to buy, it's literally, y'all, sitting down with, as a grower, this isn't quite so important when you're a home gardener, but when you're a farmer, you need to be sure that you have more than enough seed to plant the crop that you intended that you're going to grow, right? So when I am figuring out how many seeds I need, I do my seed starting plan typically in January for the whole next year. And then I would just literally go through that calendar and add up how many transplants of each individual plant I was going to purchase. And then I multiply for indoor seed starting, I multiply that by 2 to 3 times at least. I will say that I go high instead of going low, because nothing is worse than not having enough seeds.
And we will talk about ordering seed for transplants and direct seeding in the next question. So
okay. Yeah, so you just multiply by what the recommended number of seeds are by how many seeds you're going to plant. It's literally that simple.
Yep. And like Lisa was saying, so for me as a home gardener, I am definitely okay with ordering more seed, taking advantage of the cost savings, knowing that at some point, some of the seed might not germinate or I might not get through all of that. Because I'm a home gardener rather than a farmer like Lisa, if something doesn't end up working out, I can just put something else there. I'm not depending on a very specific crop being there. And when I'm going to be doing that, if it's a seed that I know I'm going to be using a lot of, what I like to do is look up viability charts. These will list typically a range of the shelf life of certain seeds. Usually it's when they're stored under optimal conditions, so do keep that in mind. But I will look at a few different charts and I will kind of take the worst case scenario and I'll see, is that worst case scenario, am I okay with that? How many years worth do I want to order at that? And that's kind of the process I use. But I definitely order multiple years at a time because I know I'm going to be storing them properly.
Yeah, that's incentive to do that too, right?
Yes, it is. All right. So how much extra seed should I order as insurance if I'm going to be direct seeding or growing transplants? So direct seeding, you also just need extra because you have to put more out and you're going to be thinning it. But how many seeds do you need to order extra if you're going to be direct seeding or growing transplants?
So when I do direct seeding math, I multiply 5. You know how many feet of flowers you want in a bed. And we oversow. So I typically would multiply my direct seeding plant want times 5 or 6 times. That's how many extra seeds, because if you want success as a direct sower, you have to overseed. You have to overplant and then thin, because it just doesn't work out. We love ants. Ants are really very good bugs, but they are the number one movers of seeds. And so that's higher. But with transplants, 2 to 3 times the number of transplants I want, is because I start twice as many seeds in soil blocks or plug trays as plants I want in the end.
And we have mentioned before in previous podcasts that this is why it's so important to know how you're going to be planting a seed before you order. You should know before you order, am I direct seeding or am I planting transplants? Because that is going to affect the quantity of seed that you order.
And it's very overwhelming when you're ordering seeds, right? But it literally comes down to just doing a little bit of math.
Yep. All right. So what is pelleted seed, and does this affect the longevity of the seed? And then a secondary question is pelleted seed the same thing as treated seed?
Okay, so pelleted seed is a seed that is covered in some type of coating. And the type of seeds that we have that are have pelleted are typically a clay-based type of coating. And it's used for, there's a couple different reasons that they pellet it. If it's a super tiny seed, like a lot of the celosias, particularly the more hybrid, the more pricier seeds, oftentimes they will coat them in an effort to make it easier to actually sow the seed. Now, sometimes zinnias, a bigger seed, and even marigolds, we've seen come in with pelleting with that clay film or film, I guess, over it. And that's done to make seeds flow through mechanical seeders. If anybody's ever used, I mean, if you're not a farmer, you probably haven't. Some farmers that do a lot of direct seeding will use these push seeders, and that pelleted clay makes them flow through the seeder much, much easier.
So pelleting is usually done, like she said, for small seeds or very irregularly shaped seeds, and it makes them a more uniform size, shape, weight. They're easier to handle when you're sowing, even by hand, but definitely if you're using a mechanical seeder, they're easier. And our seed packagers even like using them more because the weight is so consistent when it's pelleted seeds. So I get a lot of requests from them to do more pelleted seeds.
Sure.
But a lot of the seeds that I think of that are pelleted, definitely, like Lisa mentioned, some of the celosia, foxgloves, snapdragons, sweet William, feverfew. These are some of the things that oftentimes are pelleted. And a lot of times, if you receive a pelleted seed, it's stored in a tube or a vial, and that's just to prevent it getting crushed because they are very easily crushed. And I also wanted to mention during the pelleting process, these seeds are tumbled, like Lisa said, with some sort of inert material like clay, and moisture is gradually added as well. So because of this process, and we'll talk more about the effect of moisture on seeds in a little while, but because of this process, this actually does tend to shorten the life of the seeds, and it's usually advised to use pelleted seed up within a year of purchasing it, just as a general rule of thumb. I have for sure used seed beyond that time frame, but it's just a guideline.
And I think what in the second half, what is that the same as treated seeds?
Right.
And so, no, it is two totally different things. There are some seeds, seeds can be treated for different reasons. The reason that I'm aware that, for instance, like a lot of sunflower seeds can be treated with fungicides. And that's because big growers oftentimes direct sow them out into the field, and that makes them more susceptible to diseases. So we don't sell treated seed, but it is very different than the pelleting because people are very cautious about the pelleting. They think it's a treatment. It's not.
Yep, exactly. All right. I have some leftover seed from a few years ago. How can I tell if my seed is still good?
So you can do a germination test, which is super easy. I mean, can be as simple as a moist paper towel, put your seeds in it, roll it up, put it into a plastic bag, and give it a little bit of warmth, and see how many of them germinate. I mean, that is literally how people do germination tests.
So now let's talk about actually storing the seeds. So what general conditions should I aim for when storing seed, and what should I avoid?
You're looking for cool, dry, and dark, preferably. And that's why it's so often spoken of, for storing your seeds in the refrigerator or the freezer once they've gone through their proper introduction to those types of environments. But that's what we're looking for. That's what seeds sitting out in an unconditioned garage or potting shed is not a happy place for seeds to be, with that swing in the temperatures and the humidity, and none of that is good. They really should be in a controlled environment.
Yep. And like we mentioned before, the goal of storing these seeds is to keep that seed metabolism as low as possible without damaging or killing the embryos, of course. And storing these seeds in conditions that help to maintain that low metabolic rate is going to help preserve as many of those food stores as possible so that when they actually go through the germination process, they have all the energy they need to turn into healthy, strong, vigorous seedlings.
Right.
So when we're storing seeds, we really want to avoid anything that might wake the seeds up, quote unquote. I don't know
Yes.
if you ever heard of this game, Lisa, but my sister and I would play this game called Don't Wake the Dragon when we were little. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but my
I
grandma had
haven't.
this board game. Well, there was a sleeping dragon and there's these little penguins and you collect eggs on your head. And then if you have to wake the dragon, everything rumbles and the penguins and their eggs fall. Anyways, with seeds, with seed storage, it's kind of like don't wake the dragon. So anything you might do to wake a seed up, don't do that when you're trying to store it. So you don't want moisture, you don't want heat, you don't want light, you don't want fluctuating temperatures. All of these things reduce seed viability over time. And moisture is probably the greatest enemy of seed
Yes.
storage. Dry seeds, like we've mentioned, have a very low metabolic rate, but as soon as moisture content starts increasing, the enzymatic activity starts increasing, the metabolic rate starts increasing, they start using those food stores at a higher rate. And we just want to conserve as many of those food stores as possible so the seed can turn into a very healthy, strong seedling.
Yes.
And not only that, but high moisture conditions can also encourage mold growth on your seeds.
And that's where the desiccants come in, right? For the storage.
Yes, and we will talk about that for sure.
Yeah, that makes such a big difference.
All right. What type of container should I store my seeds in?
I mean, that can certainly be of your choice, but airtight is what we're looking for. When I was a home gardener, I would say a glass mason jar, that would be a really good one, or a Ziploc plastic bag. You just want it to be airtight, whatever it is.
Yep, exactly. Because seeds can and will absorb moisture from the air, which we're going to talk about desiccants in a moment. But we really don't want that to happen. We don't want a moisture exchange or a moisture transfer happening. So an airtight container is really important. And it's also important, even with Ziploc bags, sometimes those really thin sandwich bags, those might be too thin and moisture can still get through. So use a really thick Ziploc bag or double it up if you're going to be using that.
Yes.
And also keep in mind, if you're going to be storing your seeds somewhere where animals like mice or rats might have access to them, make sure to use a container that they cannot actually chew through. So should I store my seed at room temperature, in the refrigerator, or in the freezer? And what temperatures are best? So why don't you talk about these different options, Lisa?
Sure. So room temperature, I keep my house at a chilly 65 pretty much year round. That may not be too bad, but that's not the seed's best, in the seed's best interest. We're looking for anywhere in a refrigerator or in a room temperature or just air temperature, right? Between 32 and 45 degrees. Most often that's going to be your refrigerator. I don't think it's a good idea to store seeds long-term at regular air temperature. If you're looking at years, if you buy seed today and you want it for next summer and some for the summer after that, that would not be the best place for that. And then the refrigerator would be my go-to. But for long-term storage, a freezer is the very best. And then there's some steps that you go through with a desiccant and an airtight container to get them prepared for that.
Yes. And I did want to share something that I have in one of my reference books that said between 32 degrees and 122 degrees Fahrenheit, for every 10-degree rise in temperature and every 1% rise in seed moisture, the seed life is cut in half. So,
wow.
Yes. I know it's always shocking when I read that. So that alone should tell you, you definitely want to keep your seeds cooler, drier. Yep. But yeah, like Lisa said, as long as the seeds are dried properly, usually it's 5 to 8% moisture content. Not that you're going to be checking that. I've never checked that. I'm sure Lisa has never checked that. But in a refrigerator setting, 32 to 41 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 0 to 5 degrees Celsius. That's a great option for your refrigerator. or negative 0.4 to negative 4 degrees Fahrenheit, which is negative 18 to negative 20 degrees Celsius in the freezer.
Yes.
And something to be aware of, though, is I mentioned that temperature fluctuations can reduce seed viability over time. So that's why it's important, if you are storing in a refrigerator, put it in the back of the refrigerator for starters. Don't put it on the door. The door has more temperature fluctuations than anything. Yes. And also, sometimes if this is your family's refrigerator, that it's your main refrigerator you're using and it gets open and closed 100 times a day, that may be too much fluctuation. Just consider that. I have mine in a refrigerator out in the garage, which I've basically taken over with my seeds. So I'm the only one. I'm the only one going into and out of that, but just keep that in mind.
So we have a name for that, Layne. We call that our seed vault, because we have the same thing. We have one refrigerator that has nothing but seeds in it. So there's minimal going in and going out. And yeah, so that's a lot. That's good points.
Yes. All right. Why are desiccants so important to use when storing seeds in the freezer, and how can I use desiccants properly? And we did speak about this in our episode number 2 when we talked about how cool flower seeds get a 2-week treatment in the freezer. But let's talk again about why it's so important to use desiccants when you're putting seeds in the freezer.
Sure. It all comes down to condensation, right? And the desiccant, which if you're not familiar with what that is, when you buy Tylenol or a pair of new tennis shoes, there's always that little packet in there. And that's what that packet is for, is to absorb any moisture. Moisture is like really the enemy of most everything, right? Unless you're talking about a glass of water. And so the desiccants absorb. If you put a desiccant in your airtight container and allow it to absorb any moisture, and then put it in the freezer, and then you bring it out of the freezer, as it comes to room temperature, it can create condensation. And that's what the desiccant is there for. And we're going to talk about the steps, I think, here in a moment. Or we're going to talk about it now. I'm sorry, I didn't even see the second half. How can I use a desiccant properly? So for us, in a nutshell, it is put your seeds in an airtight container with a desiccant and leave it sitting on a counter for at least 48 hours. Then move it into the refrigerator or freezer. Then when it's time to take out some seeds, you then remove that from the freezer and let it again sit on the counter for at least 48 hours so it can come to room temperature, and any moisture that is created is absorbed by the desiccant. Then you can open it.
Yep. And we'll talk again about why it's so important to remove this excess moisture, which again, we talked about in episode 2, but water takes up more volume in its frozen state, its solid state, than in its liquid one, which is why if you put a bottle or can of soda in the freezer, it might pop or explode at some point. It's because the water takes up more volume once it's frozen. And when these ice crystals form, they can actually rupture the cell membranes and be deadly to your seeds. So you really need to make sure you remove any of that excess moisture. Of course, they need some moisture. That's why I said the guideline was 5 to 8% moisture content for the seed, not that you're checking, but that's why it's so important to remove any excess moisture, because we don't want these ice crystals to form and actually kill our seeds.
Who knew, right?
And in any case, whatever container you're using, whatever temperature you're storing at, it's a really good idea to keep a desiccant in that container to help absorb any excess moisture and keep your seeds dry.
But I mean, following just a few simple steps can make your seeds viable for years.
Oh, yes. Oh, I save my
really.
seeds for years. I buy huge quantities and I use them for years. Next question. Can I open up my storage container immediately when I remove it from the refrigerator or freezer? So when you're going from cold storage to a room temperature, should people just open their containers up right away?
I mean, I think this is a trick question. No, you should let it sit for 2 days, right? I mean, Layne, you might be able to answer that a little bit more detailed, but I mean, I think that the process of it causing damage is going to happen whether it happens quick or over, you know what I mean? So that answer to that is do not do that.
Yes, exactly. So you're going to take something out of the freezer or refrigerator. It's going to be a cold object in a room with warmer air. When that warm air hits that cooler object, water vapor is going to condense out of the air and onto that storage container. That is perfectly fine if it's condensing on the storage container. What we don't want is for it to condense on our seed packs. And if you opened it right away, that is exactly what would happen. You could get moisture condensing on your seed packs, rehydrating the seeds, shortening their lifespan. And that's not what we want to happen. So always let your storage container come to room temperature before opening. Okay, now we're going to move into a little bit about seed saving. We're not going to go in depth on this, but we do get a lot of questions from people about saving seed. So if I save seed from the flowers I grew this year, will the flowers next year grow true to type? And what is open pollinated versus hybrid?
So it totally depends on whether your seed is open pollinated or a hybrid, is the answer to the first half of this question. And so that's an in-depth question, which I'm feeling pretty sure there's some follow-up here. So you do not know unless you take some steps. The difference between the two is open pollinated means they will come back true. Hybrids, not so much.
Yes. And in the next question, we'll talk about some things to be aware of if you are trying to save seed, even if it's from an open pollinated. But open pollinated plants, they're genetically stable. So they're going to produce seed true to type that's like the parents, as long as they are not cross-pollinated with a different variety of the same species. And that is what we'll get into in the next question. In terms of what a hybrid is, these are crosses between two inbred lines of parent plants, and these crosses are made very deliberately to get some of the best characteristics of both parents. So maybe one tomato is delicious, but easily succumbs to disease, and another tomato is very disease resistant, but doesn't taste as good. Well, a cross might be made to try and get the best characteristics of both of these plants. So we just said that open pollinated plants are genetically stable. Hybrids, on the other hand, this is a deliberate cross of two different lines, and it's not genetically stable. So if you try to save seed from a hybrid, it's not going to produce seed true to type like the parent. And it can take years and many generations to, in fact, stabilize the genetics of these seeds if you want to create an open pollinated variety from a hybrid variety. But what I wanted to mention is, I think a common misconception is people think if it's open pollinated, that means for sure it's coming true to type without taking any additional measures. And that's true as long as it doesn't cross-pollinate with a different variety, in which case you may inadvertently create your own hybrid.
Right.
And if you're wondering if you're dealing with an open pollinated seed or a hybrid seed, you can always reach out to the company you purchased the seed from. And also hybrids are often denoted with the symbol F1, indicating that those seeds are from the first filial generation, the generation resulting from that hybrid cross. Okay, so now let's talk about if someone does want to collect their own seed, what are some things they should keep in mind, bearing in mind what we just said?
Right. So assuming that you've taken those steps, you have to allow the flower to fully mature into developing the seed into a mature seed. I'm currently saving some seeds of a specific plant here on our farm right now. And I know that only the really ripened fruit are those seeds are those pods with mature seeds inside. So, because I often say to people, anybody can save seed, whether they actually germinate next year and if they actually come back to what you think you're getting is open conversation, right? It totally depends on, so you have to allow, we're looking for the flower to develop seed and to be dry. And just some tips we like for it to have 3 days of totally dry weather before we harvest the seed pods from the plants to actually save and collect those.
Yes, it is very important that you harvest at the right stage when the seed is fully mature, and that you process that seed using the appropriate methods and then dry those seeds properly before storing.
Yes.
So I would just say some other tips I wanted to mention. Number one, if you are getting into seed saving, you should really look into getting a reference book for that, and make sure that whatever reference book you get, that it includes the things you're interested in saving seeds from. So a lot of seed saving books are focused only on vegetables. So if you're interested in saving seed from flowers, make sure that you get a book that does actually cover flowers. You're probably going to be wanting to save seed from open pollinated plants because of the reasons we just mentioned, but maybe not. Maybe you're trying to experiment and that's totally fine. You're going to want to know how the flower is actually pollinated. So is it self-pollinating? Is it pollinated by insects? Is it pollinated by wind? And then, like I mentioned, if you're trying to create a predictable result from an open pollinated plant, if you want the seed to be true to type, you're going to have to take some extra steps to make sure that that plant doesn't cross-pollinate with any other varieties. So you can either grow only that variety, but you also do need to make sure your neighbors aren't growing other varieties. So a lot of times in these seed saving books, you will see isolation distances listed, and it might say larkspur isolation distance is 100 feet. So that means that you don't want to have any other varieties of larkspur growing within 100 feet, or you actually risk the plant cross-pollinating with that variety.
Yes.
And these isolation requirements vary greatly depending on the plant species you're dealing with. So self-pollinating plants tend to require less distance between varieties, while some wind-pollinated plants can have extremely long distances required of a mile or more. So isolation distance is very dependent on the plant you're dealing with. If you can't isolate by that amount, there are a lot of other things you can do. You can try to time it so you don't have two different varieties blooming at the same time. You can somehow put bags on the blooms. Maybe you want to hand pollinate them yourself, or sometimes people will do an alternate day method where they kind of cover and exclude the insects, the pollinating insects on one variety on one day, and then uncover that variety the next day while covering up the variety that was exposed the day before. There's a lot that goes into it. So you just need to make sure that if you're trying to get seed true to type, that you consider all these things. Unless, like I said, you want to be surprised and you're happy just saving the seed and seeing what comes back from it, in which case, go for it.
It's true. It is really, really true. Some really fun sunflowers are developed that way. Some really exciting celosias are done that way. It's very exciting. We leave a patch of celosia reseeding every year, and we get some of the most fabulous colored coxcombs, but we've never taken the steps to develop them to provide those to other people. It's a chance.
Yes. Yeah. And seed saving in that way is a really fun thing that home gardeners can do and experiment with. If you're a farmer and you need to be able to rely on this seed, you're expecting a certain result, that's when you need to be a bit more careful about saving versus buying seed of a particular variety.
You know, that brings up just a little side note. That's what oftentimes affects the cost of seeds that have to be, that need isolation, that need all of these additional steps. And then let's add in some of the seeds, some of the flowers, like some of the specific coxcombs that I now grow, they don't develop much seed. So they have to be isolated. They have to grow a lot of a crop to get a fewer number of seeds. And all these pieces play a role. All of a sudden, the most expensive seed you purchase is all of a sudden not so expensive anymore. When you consider all the steps and that you're having insurance that it is going to be what it's supposed to be.
Yes. All right. So now we're going to be on to the last question. And I wanted to include this because this is a really fun seed to save. So how can I save the seed from my giant poppy pods?
So the years that we save the giant poppy pod seeds, we don't grow other types of poppies, just as a measure. And so we leave, so the giant poppy pods get that big, beautiful flower. The flower only lasts about 24 to 48 hours. Then all those petals fall off and expose this gorgeous big green pod that then starts to swell and develop. Now, as a fresh cut flower, we cut it in that fresh, beautiful green color to sell as a cut flower, right? To be as an ornament. But if you want to save seeds, you just leave the pot out in the garden and it just gets bigger and bigger. I'm telling you, some of them they're much bigger than my fist. I mean, they can just get so huge, and you wait till they're totally dry. And when you shake the stem, you can hear the seeds inside, and that's when they're ready. The more mature, as Layne mentioned earlier, the more mature, the better the germination. So, leave them out there as long as you can without losing them for whatever reason, from weather. Or if you have 10 days of rain coming, that's the time I go out there and look at the poppy pods and say, are they really ready? We ought to get them out of this wet environment that's coming.
Yes. And I once came in to my office at the gardener's workshop to a giant bucket of poppy pods in my chair. Lisa had just said, left something on your chair. And that's what it was. It was a giant bucket of poppy pods.
And we literally just crack them open and dump out the seeds. I mean, it's really that simple. We just cut the tops off the pods and dump them out, and then follow the steps to store them properly.
Yep, of course. All right. Well, that was our last question. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. As always, if you enjoyed listening to this episode or watching it on YouTube, we would really appreciate a rating, a review, a like, or a comment. Thank you so much for joining us.
And share us with your friends. We love to have new listeners and friends. Until we meet again. Ciao.
Bye.